Today we come and talk about the N in launch, which is the name neighbor. Neighbor. How in the world can we be a church that expresses in our community great compassion for our community? That's what we'll talk about today. And I remember to say to you before I go any further, I think we probably do as good a job as any, but we all know there's much room for improvement. As a young man, while I was at UTC, I was called one day by, I don't know how it happened. I never went back to try to do the research. I was called. I remember we had a bulletin board in the Baptist Student Union at UTC, and when you would walk in, he'd always look. Y'all realize that we lived a whole life before cell phones. Did y'all know that? There used to not be cell phones. There were landlines. So you would get a message. If someone ever called the Baptist Student Union looking for you, they would pin a note on this board. And so when I lived there, when I wasn't in class, I was literally there all the time. That's where I met my wife, Tracy. A lot of great things happened at that place. And you would always walk in, and there was a note on the board that said that this particular church had called wanting to talk to you. And I called the pastor, and I don't know how to this day how he found me or anything, but he wanted to know if I would consider coming to be their student minister. And I served in that church for a little over a year before I was pursued by a different church that today has a different name on Highway 58. I think it's called Cornerstone now, but then it was called Avondale Baptist Church. For those that know anything about Chattanooga, the Avondale area of Chattanooga, which is really close to where Memorial Hospital is, turned into a really, really crime-infested area. They literally had built fences around their church with barbed wire over them, and it still did not keep people from stealing cars and doing damage to their buildings. And so the only thing they needed to do was they moved and bought this acreage on Highway 58 many, many years ago and moved their church, but they never changed the name. It was Avondale Baptist Church, even though Avondale was in another place. And I remember when I came on staff, this pastor, he was a great pastor. I mean, he was a great preacher. Can I say that? He was an excellent preacher, but he had no idea how to pastor a church. And within just a few months of being on the staff there, he got up and he preached a sermon one Sunday, and I still remember after all these years the title of his message. It was called The Missions Sermon. The Mission Sermon. And in that sermon, he said something that I've never forgotten. He said this: missions is not so much crossing the seas as it is seeing the cross. That has stuck with me all these years. There's nothing wrong with being a church that cares about going overseas and doing missions. We are that kind of church. But we can't do that and ignore the community that's around us. The word church in Greek is the word ekklesia. It's used 120 times in the Bible, and it almost always, at least over 80% of the time, it refers to a local body just like this. Did you know that it's God's will to reach the world through local churches just like this? God never intended there to be this universal, gigantic church named whatever in America or in the world that everybody was a part of. He intended local churches with great accountability to their community and to their people to reach their community for Christ. And so it's God's will, first and foremost, that a church start its mission right where they're planted and move outside of that. And again, I'm not saying that we should not go overseas. We should, but never to ignoring the community that God has placed us in. That's what the ecclesia does. The church is the ecclesia. It's a word that means the gathered ones, those who gather to worship. The church is not an institution. It's not a building. It's not a building with a steeple. It's not a denomination. The church are the people of God who gather together to worship. And that is happening all over the planet as we speak today. Some people have a building to come into. We know that we have our friend, Pastor Mindy, who probably is meeting under those cashew trees somewhere in Gambia today, but worshiping Jesus with a great fervency. It's the gathered people of God. Well, one of the great problems that's happened in our society today is as times have gotten tough, when the world has become increasingly a difficult place to be, not even a safe place to be in many cases, churches have made the mistake of turning inward. Now listen to me and listen to me carefully. Churches must take care of themselves. Our testimony to the world, which is what we see in Acts chapter 2, is a group of people that were taking care of one another. They were meeting the needs. In Acts 2, we see that they were willing to even sell what they had so others could have. They were meeting together. It says daily they were together in God's Word. They were praying together. They were making sure that they shared meals together, and they were fellowshipping together. God intends His church to do that. But we never turn inward to the point and circle the wagons to the point that we forget about what's going on outside of our church. And I made the comment years ago, we actually had a TV commercial a long time ago before a lot of you came here where I said on this stage this church exists for those that are not here yet. And I believe that. In other words, what we do is we come together today. What really is happening today is we come together to encourage one another and be lifted up. And some of us needed to cry about something today, and some needed to celebrate about something today. But we came together with our family, our real family, to do life together so that we can be equipped and encouraged to go out of this place and impact the world around us. That's God's intention. So yes, we should take care of one another, but never forget that the reason that we're here today is so we can be the best we can be to go out of this place and be the best that we can be. And so, being a neighbor, what does it really mean to be a neighbor? Well, let's talk about that today and how we can be a neighbor that makes a difference in this world. I made a comment several weeks ago. If the church at Grace Point, that now is 21 years old, if we cease to exist this week, would anyone even notice? Would our neighborhood and would our community miss us if we weren't here? And I think a lot of churches might be honest to say to themselves, I'm not so sure we'd be missed. I sure hope we would be. I think we would be. I pray that we would be, but it is a good thought, isn't it? If we didn't even exist at the end of this week, would anybody even notice? It should be our job for the rest of the time that God allows us on this earth to make sure that our community could never possibly forget about us. And I know I get to go, I'm so thankful to live in a community that on a routine basis I get to go to city council meetings and council meetings for our county, and I get to go to school board meetings, and they let me pray publicly. And I always thank them for letting us still do that. And often I hear comments, thank you, Pastor, for what your church does in our community. I heard about this project y'all did. I heard about this thing you did. I heard about that ramp that you built. That word spreads, and we hope our community would never want us to ever go away. And so how can we be a church that does that? God's Word says this in James chapter 1, verse 27, a verse we talk about a lot in church. It's pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Pure and undefiled religion, it's not given as the answer there, but why is it pure and undefiled religion that we visit a widow and an orphan? Here's why: because they can't do anything for you. Often in life we do things for other people because there's something in it for us. Y'all know I'm telling you the truth. I want to get on the good side of this person because it's going to come back to me. What happens when you do something for someone that cannot possibly do anything for you? The Bible says that's pure and it's undefiled. The ultimate example of that is Jesus Christ himself, right? Every ounce of grace and mercy he's extended to this world was completely undeserved. There was not anything we could do to deserve what he's done for us, and yet he did it anyway. And so he's our ultimate example. And so the question today is this: how can we be a church that truly pours in compassion to the community around us that they would never, ever possibly forget us? Well, let's talk about that. We have the greatest story that really tells this story in the Bible in these verses. And to save a little time, we're going to go through them verse by verse in just a minute. But let's just walk through this outline I've given you. The first thing I listed here is this: we have, without question, compassion defined. Compassion defined. In verse 25, a passage that I love, and I could preach probably 4 sermons from just these first few verses, says this: a lawyer stood and put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, and your neighbor as himself." Verse 28, he says this: and he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." Well, before we go any further, let's talk about what compassion is. What is compassion? Literally, compassion is suffering with another, or I love this definition, painful sympathy. What is compassion? It's truly suffering with another. I remember a story I told about 20 years ago in this church. I say there's probably very few of you that were here 20 years ago, so maybe you've never heard this story. In a day and time when I lived, There was a time in my life that my mother, if we'd had a corner store down the street, as a little boy, she could have sent me down there. It was completely okay. Do y'all remember, is anybody in the room like me? In the summertime, I would leave my house in the morning and stay in my neighborhood somewhere all day, riding my bike and maybe swimming in this swimming pool. And parents talked to one another and they would say, if he's ever a line, you just give him a spanking or whatever. Well, I lived in a community like that where it was completely safe. You'd be out of your mind today to let your child do what we used to do on a regular basis. As long as I could hear my dad whistle when he got home from work, I knew I was good. That day's gone, but this story was back in that day. It just so happened that this mother was finishing up supper one day, and they had a little store just a few blocks down, and she said, I need some butter to finish up supper, and said to her little girl, gave her a few dollars, and said, would you go down to the store and get some butter, and I'll finish up supper. Well, that whole journey would take maybe 10 minutes for her to go down there and do that, and so the mother got busy finishing up the supper that we're going to have, and she looked at her watch and said, you know, it's been about 10 minutes. She should be back by now. But she went back to finishing this and getting that done and finishing this up and looking what's in the oven. And then she looked about 5 minutes later and said, you know, she really ought to be back by now. But she got busy and she's making sure this isn't burning and that's whatever. You women are amazing that can multitask in the kitchen. I don't have that ability. But anyway, finally, after about 20 minutes, she goes, you know, I'm kind of concerned. And so she decided she'd walk down the street and see what was going on with her daughter. And about the time she grabbed the doorknob, the little girl walked in. And she did what any parent would do. Where have you been? I've been worried about you. The little girl said, well, Mom, I was on my way back from the store, and my friend was out in her front yard, and her doll had broken. And she said, oh, I understand. You stayed to help her fix her doll. And she said, no, Mom, I stopped to help her cry. When's the last time you cried with somebody? When what they were going through so impacted you because you cared about them so much, it was almost as though it was happening to you. Think about that. When have you cried with someone? Does that kind of bring to light this definition, painful sympathy? We have the ultimate example in Jesus, don't we? And I literally could stand here for 30 minutes and read passages like this, but let me just give you a few. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 14, Jesus felt compassion for the crowd. So what did he do? He healed the sick and he fed the 5,000. You don't have to go much farther. In Matthew 30, verse 34, Jesus felt compassion for the blind men at Jericho, and so he healed them. We could go on and on and on. Words like this, Jesus felt compassion. Can I ask you a personal question for just a minute? Do you have any compassion for the community around us? When you see the statistics of this town, listen to me, Cleveland's an awesome place, and I don't want to raise my family anywhere else, but if you think this is a perfect place, you have your head in the sand. Every problem that exists on this planet exists in Bradley County. Yes, everybody thinks they're a Christian here because they grew up in Cleveland, but that's not the case. This is a very lost town, a very deceived town. I've told you before, every fruit, flake, and nut, religiously speaking, exists in Cleveland, Tennessee. And I say that in the name of Jesus. There's great confusion in this town about a lot of stuff. And why Cleveland seems to be the home to all of that, I do not know. This town is in need of a church that literally cares about them, that loves them, that will cry for them. Is that you? How can we be like Jesus? Well, he gives us, I wish I had time. I don't have time, so I'm going to give you the cliff notes. He says in verse 27, he answered and said, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. I've preached this sermon before. Don't let me re-preach it. But we got to stay for a second, okay? The word heart is the word viscera. It literally means the inward parts of man. When it says, when I say to my wife, I love you with all of my heart, I'm not saying I love you with a pump that's in my chest. That's kind of gross, isn't it? It's I love you with everything I have physically. Am I the only man in the room? If they put a gun to my head and a gun to my wife's head, it's not even a question. I don't have to pray about whether you should blow me away. Blow me away. Am I the only man in the room that would stand in front of anything to protect his family? That's what that means. I love you with all of my heart. Do we love Jesus that way is the question. If you want to be a person of genuine compassion, we have to be like him. He's the model. He's the example. And the first thing we must do is we have to love Him with all of our heart, with everything we have physically. He says, love me with all of your soul, everything we have spiritually. I can't preach this. I got to be careful. I'll keep going. With all of my strength, that speaks to, again, this idea of everything you have physically, and with all of my mind. Go to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Talks about renewing your mind. Your mind is so key to your love to Him. What you allow in your mind is so incredibly important, especially in the day that we're living in today. There's no check in our spirit over a lot of stuff that goes in our mind that we should reject immediately or never allow in to begin with. Do you love Him with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind? I told a story probably 20 years ago as well in this church. When I was in my very first church in Causeyville, Mississippi, I promise you it's probably not on a map. It's 19 miles outside of Meridian, Mississippi, at a four corners called Causeyville. It is not incorporated. It exists of a church on one corner, a parsonage on the other, a used car lot on the other, and a house on the other. Just up the street is the Causeyville General Store. And that's where God allowed me to spend the first 3.5 years of my ministry, and it was a glorious place to be. God did an amazing thing there. Well, as you might suspect, I was very young. I was 26 years old. There was not a house within 2 miles of that church that I did not individually walk up on the front porch, knock on the door, introduce myself, and invite them to church. One of the families in my church, I need to be careful because I know some of those people may watch this online. I'll make up a name. Ledford. That's not their name. I'll just make up the name Ledford. The Ledford family, precious, precious family. The father the mother, was a wonderful Christian woman. She had since remarried, and it was only after being there for a few years that I learned the fate of her first husband, and also why that their son never came to church. Their son at that time was probably about my age, in his middle 20s. And every time I would see him up at the old Causeyville General Store, I would invite him to church, but he never, ever would come. I've always been pretty good at inviting people to church, and I don't give up on people, and I've always eventually got them to church, but it seemed like I just couldn't get past this facade. If I could describe this young man to you, if you were looking in the dictionary and a professional wrestler, think of the biggest wrestler you can imagine. This guy was a hulk of a human being. It's like when he walked by, the sun went dark. He was huge. He ended up being a logger by trade, and I remember they would say he could just like put a tree on his shoulder and carry it out of the woods. He was a massive human being. He had a real tender spirit, but he was a massive, massive human being. It was only later that, talking to the mom, I found out that one day when he was a teenager, she said, "Go tell Dad it's time for supper." They were farmers, and he was out on his tractor in the fields. "Go tell Dad it's time for supper." And when he got to the tractor out in the woods, he found his father dead of a massive heart attack out there, and it just cold-cocked him. Just a young teenage boy, and no one needs to see that with their eyes. And it just took him in a place, and he was mad at God and mad at anything to do with the church and the whole bit. Why did he take my dad, the whole bit? And now I understood why. Every time I talked to him about coming to church, it was a non-starter. Now, can I tell you, I don't know if it was Mother's Day or a special day. I don't remember. But I got up on, we only had about 200 people that you could seat in this auditorium that we had, this church. And it was packed. And I remember one Sunday I get up to preach, and I look back, and there he is in church. Well, in my heart, I'm rejoicing. But I'm telling you that when I gave the invitation, he grabbed a hold of that pew in front of him, and I'm telling you, this guy could pick the pew up. It was kind of unbelievable. And he came back the next week, and the next week, and the next week. And I'll never forget that day for the rest of my life. I walked down to give the invitation after the service. I was standing there, and he let go of the pew, and he started walking down the aisle. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know, am I in trouble? You know, this guy's, he's a big boy. And I wish every one of you could have been a fly on the wall to hear what he said as we knelt at that simple altar. And he just, he's so embarrassed to be a big old hulk of a guy. And he says, "Phil, I know I need to be saved." And he prayed the sweetest little prayer and gave his life to Christ, right? It was as genuine as it could be. And I'll never forget when we finished praying, he just kind of looked over at me as we're knelt down there, and he said, "Pastor, can I just slide out the side door?" I said, buddy, you know you can. It's okay. And so he kind of just, a little embarrassed, slipped out the side door. And I'll never forget when I stood up, I looked at my people. And I saw people crying, genuinely rejoicing, probably prayed a lot of prayers, probably taught him in Sunday school, and years ago had him in vacation Bible school, or just crying, so thankful. But the other people I saw kind of made me sick on my stomach. Y'all met these people? By looking at their faces, they were like, I can't believe he would do a scene like that in our church. Or, you know, I know him. Just give him a few weeks. He'll be back out. He'll be back in the bars doing what he's done before. It's not going to stick. Do you know what it would take for that young man in that community to follow Jesus with all of his heart, with all of his soul, with all of his strength, with all of his mind? It would take everything he has. Do you know what it takes to follow Jesus in 2025? Everything you have. And the problem is we're just tipping God with our time and tipping him with our talent and tipping him with our skills, and we don't give him all of us. What would happen today if a body of believers said, you know what, I'm all in. Jesus, really do take all of me. Let the priority of my life start with you, not with the leftovers of my life. What would it be like if you could stand before him and say, God, I love you with all of my heart, with all of my soul, with all of my strength, and God, even with all of my mind? That is the definition of compassion. It's to love him. And he'll show you how to love like he loves. Number two, have compassion. We have compassion depicted. The word depicted simply means a visual image, right? He gives us a visual image in this passage. And if just to save a little time, go to verse 30. It says, Jesus replied and said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down and on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, he came to that place and saw him and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, of all people, a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. And he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, and pouring oil and wine on them, he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii and he gave it to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor of the man who fell into the robber's hands? The word neighbor is an interesting word in Greek. It's the word pleason. It literally means this: fellow man, those who are outwardly near to us. That may not be the definition you had in your mind when you got here. We think of a neighbor as maybe somebody we know their first and last name. We know whether they have dogs or cats in their house or what kind of car that they drive. I have neighbors. You have neighbors. And we're living in a day today when no one wants to really know their neighbor. I lived in a day and still live in a day. I want to know who my neighbors are. I want to be there for my neighbors. I want to be somebody they can trust. But that's not really what this word means. What it literally means, if we can put it in southern slang, is this: whoever you bump into. How about that? Whoever you bump into, you don't have to have a relationship with them. Your neighbor, according to what this passage is saying, is somebody you just bumped into. Did the Samaritan know this guy before he got? No. But he says, which one proved to be his neighbor? And so don't think, and I believe with this on my heart, I believe in the theory that says this: you should earn the right to share Jesus with someone. I believe that. Establishing a relationship with someone and caring about them, meeting them right where they are, not beating them over the head with a Bible and telling them what they should do and get that earring out of here and cut that hair and whatever. What craziness. You should earn the right to share Jesus with somebody by loving them and building a relationship. But sometimes it's just a chance happening. Your neighbor is who you bump into just walking around in your everyday life. So he says, which one proved to be that neighbor? Write a couple things down. I want you just to write this statement down, if you will. It's not in your notes. Genuine compassion goes beyond the call of duty. Just write that down. Genuine compassion goes beyond the call of duty. Here's the visual image. Number one, write this down. He first made the decision to get involved. He made the decision, I'm going to get involved. Again, in verse 30, it tells the whole story, but then when you get down, if you see in verse 33, it says, but a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion for him. He made a decision. We're living in a day and time when people will gladly see a car accident and be really glad to call 911 and report to the cops that there's an issue at such and such corner. Y'all need to go take care of that. We live in a society today, because I can tell you this because I own this t-shirt. And I love you and I appreciate you, but this happens in my life way too often. Not too long ago, a gentleman in our church walked out of Fullen's restaurant and noticed a couple that was sitting on the bench out there that were homeless. And so he did the right thing. He called Phil, not the right thing. He called Phil Griffin on the phone to say, Phil, there's a homeless couple over here sitting on this bench. Can you come help them? And I did. But that's not the right reaction. That's the reaction of the world today. Or can we call a government agency to come take care of them? No, what you should do is you should help them. They're hungry. Get them something to eat. They need somebody to talk to. Sit down and talk to them. He made the decision, I'm going to get my hands dirty. I'm going to get in the middle of something I don't even know what it is exactly. And the amazing thing is this, Samaritans were hated by Jews. A Jew would not even say anything nice about a Samaritan. And only God could turn this whole thing around and say, the Samaritan's now caring for this Jewish dude. That throws the whole thing out, right? And it says neighbor to somebody that would never want to even call this person their neighbor. And so you got to make a decision. You are going to have an example probably in the next 30 days of your life to get involved in something that you don't know everything about it. It may be messy, it may be dirty, but God's Holy Spirit is telling you, you need to get involved. And I just wonder what would happen in a town like this where 400 or 500 people said, you know what, I'm willing to get my hands dirty if it needs to be to show the love of Jesus to my community. Never forget, Johnny Earl lived right across the street from me. Remember I described the church on one corner, parsonage on the other corner, used car lot? They would not allow you to do what he was doing in his yard in any city limits, but we're way out in the country, so you did whatever you want. It was literally a junkyard that surrounded his house. And I remember I walked over there 1,000 times, it seemed like, in those 3.5 years to talk to Johnny Earl about coming to church. I was probably the 5th or 6th pastor, maybe 10th pastor over the years that had walked over there and asked Johnny Earl to come to church. And I'll never forget one day he said to me, preacher, I'd rather see a good sermon than hear one any day. And what he was saying to me, if you're paying attention, is the talk's cheap. Lots of people walked over and asked me to church and told me about Jesus, whatever, but then I see the way they're living their life and it's fake. What if we decided that we would get involved? He made the decision he was going to get involved in what was going on. His compassion moved him to action. Number B underneath that, write this down to the letter B. He contemplated the further need. Remember I said that genuine compassion goes the extra mile? Look what he goes on to say, and he came to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, and he put him on his own beast and brought him to the inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii, which is 2 days' wages. That is very sacrificial, 2 days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robber? He contemplated getting involved even further. I wish my wife were in the room. My wife's in the nursery today with my daughter, and she spends a lot of time back there because of helping Peyton, and I appreciate about her, but I wish she could be here because she would probably scold me after church for telling this. But my wife, have y'all met these people before, is a magnet for hurting people. I remember we were dating. I've known her for 41 years, almost 42 years. She's the greatest lady I ever met. Oh, my goodness. And wherever she worked, she always seemed to end up like at jewelry stores and stuff. I've sat outside of a jewelry store waiting for her to get off of work, and her come out and say, you'll never guess, this lady that started working here today, Phil, she's going through a difficult time, and I don't think she's in a real safe environment at the house she's in, and what are we going to do? She's like 19 years old, and she just has this compassion for people. I don't know how many strays she took in. I don't know how many times she dug in her own wallet, and back in those days, she was an envelope girl. Cashed her check, and she used that. She was Dave Ramsey before Dave Ramsey was, right? She was doing that thing. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And I just think that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. I wish she had kept our finances over the year. We've been great. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know how many times I watched her sacrificially care for other people, to go the extra mile, to have them come and stay at the house one night because her husband's beating him. I've driven with her to these places and taken people places just because, and this is long. I'm telling you, 19 years old doing these kinds of things. Have you met that person before? And so the thought is this, the first thing I'll say, you need to hear this. Sometimes when you get involved in helping somebody and showing genuine compassion, you don't know where that's going to take you. There have been times when we deliver the Christmas baskets every year. Y'all been with me to do this. I've been to homes in Bradley County that do not have floors in them. There's dirt floors. I've had machetes. Guys come out with a machete to try to attack me because they wonder why I was there, the whole bit. Mike Guerin and I went to a place a few years ago. I'm telling you, as I'm looking straight ahead right now, I could count 100 roaches running all over the furniture and over the floor and whatever in government housing right here in town. You know what that led to? Me and Mike Guerin on the phone calling people saying, you need to get over there and take care of this. You know what ended up happening? We paid for an exterminator to go over and get those. I could not go to bed that night thinking that man's got roaches climbing all over and nobody cares. You may have to dig in your wallet. You may have to give some of your time. You may have to make sure that you can get somebody somewhere because they don't have a car. I don't know what it may be, but it might not be a one-time encounter. You up for that? I used to jokingly, my mother, I'll call her after church. My dad was, I'm just like him. I am my dad reincarnated. It's amazing. I love, like at holidays, for just having my family around me. Don't look at me strange like that. I wouldn't care if a stray came in, but you know what I'm saying? I really like being with my family. We have a great time together and whatever. And I remember when I was a teenager, my mom, she'd find these strays everywhere. It could be a dog, a cat, but sometimes it was human beings. And I've sat at a dining room table on Thanksgiving with total strangers before because my mom met them at the grocery store and knew they needed somebody to have dinner with that and just invite them over. My dad would sit there and he'd be so kind and he'd smile. And when she left, he'd like, don't do that again. Are you willing to get your hands dirty? Years ago, there was a gentleman that was a part of our church, and I know that Deidre's going to know who I'm talking about, and Bobby will know, and I won't call his name, but I had known him before this church even existed. And the ultimate EGR, extra grace required. He would call me and say, my remote to my TV doesn't work. Okay. And I would drive over to his apartment and figure out that it needed new batteries or that he had pushed the wrong button. And I'm not good with it. I'm not the guy to call on technology, so don't call me if you need that. I'll find somebody for you. I'm not your guy. I'd walked with this guy for years and years through stuff I can't even describe to you. He would cut on himself. And I distinctly remember this day, me and Tracy are backing down the driveway to go on a date night. Something I've not done near enough in my marriage. We cleared the night. Our girls are old enough to take care of themselves. We're backing down the driveway and the phone rings and it's this guy. Phil, I've hurt myself. Please come. Please come. You have no idea how much I respect my wife. I've lost count how many times that she's just gone, you know what? Just pull back up. I got it. So I dump my wife out and I rush over there and I walk into a horror flick of a guy who's cut himself, and there's blood everywhere, and there's roaches and nastiness everywhere. And I'd bought soap for him and shoes for him, and he wore the same size clothes I wore, so I'd given him a wardrobe of clothes, and it was the most incredible thing. And I remember I just pulled him over to that sink, and I took that soap, and I scrubbed it, and he was screaming. I was so upset that he had done that to himself, and just scrubbing that whatever and sat down with him, and I thought, what have I got myself into? And I praise God for Deidre and Bobby and others that came along. It kind of took that weight off me that I'd been carrying for years, and they went probably farther than I ever went into that. I didn't sign up for that. That all started one day when a guy that got out of prison for something horrible that he had done was in a prison cell with a guy that grew up in Cleveland, Tennessee, and he said, man, Cleveland's the greatest place. I grew up in Cleveland. So he says, I got to start my life over somewhere. I'm just going to go to Cleveland. And he stops by First Baptist Church one day to the reception and said, can I speak to the pastor? And I was the idiot pastor that was there at the time that would meet with anybody. Try that today. I suspect maybe you wouldn't get that, but anybody walked up, I told the receptionist, if I got time, send them my way. And this guy walks and sits in my office and tells me his horrible story, and that started, I don't even know how many years, 15 or more years. I didn't sign up for that, but I don't regret it. Do you think Jesus would have had compassion? Let's talk about one other thing. I love this. He pulls out 2 denarii, and he says, I got to go. I'm on a business trip. I got somewhere I got to be. Take care of him. And if you use more than this, when I come back by, I'll settle accounts with you. Look at me for a minute, folks. In the process of getting your hands dirty, in the process of caring enough to get involved, sometimes you got to call in some help. God does not intend you to do it all by yourself. And that's why the church is so important. If you only knew the needs that have presented themselves to this church that started with somebody needs some furniture in a house, I can't do that by myself, but I got some partners that can. And have we done some things together? Have we built some ramps together? Have we fixed some things together? Have we taken some groceries together? Have we met needs together? And so hear this. Maybe you're the one who identifies the need, and maybe you go all in with that, but sometimes you got to call in some help. And I got great news for you. You got people that care in this church that'll help you. And one of the great things about that is that you both get the blessing of being involved. I better press on. Number 3, we have compassion demonstrated. Compassion demonstrated. He says in verse 37 these words, and he said, the one who showed mercy, that's the one. And Jesus said to him, don't miss these words, go and do the same. Wow. Go and do the same. I want to ask you 3 things. Number 1, as we talk about getting up and doing something, going and doing what he's told us to do, are you willing to make this a matter of prayer? Are you willing to pray about it? If you were a fly on the wall in my truck as I drive to work every day, you would hear me say these words because I say them every single. Sometimes I think God must hate that I say them maybe, but I know he doesn't. Every day of my life, I pray this prayer: God, give me a divine appointment today. I'm telling you guys, it is remarkable the things he's dropped in my lap in praying that. What if every day of your life it wasn't just about you and about your schedule and what you had planned? God, if you need to interrupt my day today to give me an opportunity to show somebody the love that you've given to me, I'm all in. Are you willing to at least pray that God would give you some opportunities like this? Number 2, are you willing to make it personal? You willing to take this personal? Not, oh, Pastor, I was over here at such and such, and there's some folks over here that have a flat tire. Can you come fix their flat tire? Are you willing to be that person? Are you willing to get your hands dirty? And I've watched and know of so many opportunities that you guys have had that you've done exactly that. Take it personal. Yes, there's opportunities for us as a church to do amazing things, but I wish we could see what God does individually every day in our lives and the corporate thing that is accomplished through that. One last thing. Are you willing to refuse to procrastinate? I shared with you in 2019, toward the end of 2019, y'all might remember that weird time, that God had put on my heart, and we're closing with this, to find a pastor somewhere in Cleveland, Tennessee that didn't look like me. I didn't care if they were Hispanic or black. They could be white and spoke another language. If they were a Russian church, I didn't really care about that. That's up to God. God, would you bring into my path someone that doesn't look like me, that's a pastor in this town, that I don't think you guys understand. Larry, I know you understand this. The church is hemorrhaging in a horrible way. If the church in the United States was a patient at the hospital, it would be an ICU with all these pipes and fluids being pumped into it to keep it alive. I shared with you a few weeks ago, the latest statistics by George Barna say that 95% of the churches in America are not growing through the baptistry. In other words, about 10 to 15 of churches, 15% are saying we're having growth, but it's really just folks leaving another church going to another church. Actually change lives, it is almost non-existent. Did you know that there are dozens of churches in Cleveland, Tennessee, if something drastic doesn't happen in the next year, they're not going to be here? Did you know that there are pastors, because I've met them, that are praying right now when no one's watching? God, if you don't do something, I want to find that dude. I met a pastor not long ago that works at Coca-Cola bottling factory. He works 50 hours a week there, and then in his spare time, he visits hospitals. In his spare time, he tries to write a sermon for Sunday and Sunday night and Wednesday night. In his spare time, which is non-existent. And he is spending every plate he possibly can and trying to be a good dad and trying to be a good husband to his wife. And right now, he is at his wit's end. And even doing all of that right now, it's not looking good. I want to find that guy. I shared this vision with you years ago. I want this church to go find that dude in that church, and I want to show up. I want us to plan an incredible block party for their church. I want to pay for all the blow-ups, and I want us to have T-shirts made that we can all wear that don't even mention the name of the church at Grace Point. It just has their church's name on it. And when we go out in that community and we canvass that community, invite people to this block party, we never mention Grace Point. We only mention their church because they're our partners and they're part of the church, right? Pure and undefiled religion. It has nothing to do with us, but God has blessed us, and to whom much is given, much is required. And I want to come along the side of a church like that. And it may be a one-time event, but it may be a lifetime journey together. And see them turn that around. And we all give God the glory because it'll be God that'll do it. It won't be us. Don't you want to be a church like that? I want to go demonstrate. I'm tired of talking about compassion and preaching sermons about compassion, having classes about how to be a compassionate church. And folks, I know I'm preaching to the choir. We are a compassionate church. But I want to go to the next level. And I hope they never mention the name of this church, but they just mention, look what God did. Look what God did. Don't you want to do something like that? And so let's pray together that God led me to that pastor years ago, and I don't think that's an opportunity anymore. COVID happened, and we couldn't do it. But COVID's over, and it can come back if it wants to, but it will not deter us. We're going to do this. So would you pray? Pray that God reveals exactly. It may be more than one church. Who knows? But to whom much is given. And folks, nobody's been blessed more than we have. Much is required. You willing to pray about it? Will you pray about it? Will you pray with me about it? Will you make it personal? Don't point your finger at somebody else because three are pointing at you. And folks, the time for procrastination is over. Too much planning goes on and not enough action. I'm ready to get my hands dirty. How about you?